This is episode 126, where you'll be meeting the visionary Suzy Nethercott-Watson. Suzy's the founder of the charity Two Green Threads, a nationally registered not-for-profit which is focused on supporting the carers who themselves support the injured and orphaned wildlife across Australia. Building a business and life that blends contribution, fulfillment and financial reward? Welcome to Your Next Chapter, the show for women in their 40s and beyond who are on this adventure. I'm Angela Rasmus and I'm delighted you're here. Hello there and welcome to another episode of the Your Next Chapter podcast. This is a continuation of our Under the Radar series where we're talking with ordinary women who are doing extraordinary things in their next chapters. And I'm delighted to introduce you today to Suzy Nethercott-Watson. We were having a little bit of a chat before I hit record about how sometimes it's really difficult to give ourselves a bit of a one-liner as in who we are and what we do. Sometimes it's hard to be pigeonholed, especially when you've had a portfolio career that has then catapulted you into this new place within your next chapter. So Suzy, thank you so much for spending your time here with us today.
Thanks, Angela.
I was really curious when we first started talking about all the different paths that have sort of been, you described it as a portfolio. I think about it almost as a mosaic and how life is lived forward, but it's understood backwards. So when we look back on where we've been, we can often find the threads that connect all the pieces together. So when you do that, Suzy, what do you see when you're looking back there and contemplating what your sort of purposeful approach to the world has been?
I guess, Angela, it's a theme of service. So the roles that I've done, which have been really diverse over the years, have really come from a place of where can I make a difference and what will it mean as part of the world. And I've been quite deliberate about that. In one of the last roles that I did whilst doing full-time executive public service positions, I was very specific about the departments that I wanted to work for and what roles I was going for. And, you know, that was based partly on where I'd come from and what I'd done. And defence and environment were the two sort of areas that really spoke to me and I wanted to make a difference in. So I think when I look back on what you're describing as the mosaic of my different roles that I've had in life to date, then, yeah, I would say service would be a common theme.
Yeah, I think you and I are definitely united there. I mean, I really believe that is our purpose. No matter how we actually express it, at the end of the day, we're here to help others. Otherwise, you can feel like a little bit purposeless. That's the way that I've always felt about it. And you've talked about how you're deeply connected to our environment and really doing what you can in that respect when we're going through some pretty unprecedented challenges in the natural world. So the chapter that you've stepped into is establishing the two green threads, which we're going to unpack for sure in this conversation. But could you talk a little to that idea of why the environment is so important to you and why you feel so drawn there?
I think partly my hesitation comes from a place of trying to work out whether I can describe it. I have great respect and am in awe of the indigenous culture that has connection to country as a, you know, element that is talked about and described. And I came to realise just how much that embodied more than just, you know, living on a land or standing on ground or something like that. There's a greater connection to the life being that is our natural environment. And I'm in awe of the indigenous culture, and I wish that it had a much stronger central place in our Western culture, because I can sort of relate to that in terms of what it means. I live on a rural property, and as I'm talking to you, just looking up and looking out at the trees and the branches and leaves that are moving. And I can't describe to you that, you know, to me, we are connected to that and we make a difference to the stability and future of that in what we do and how we do it. And so, you know, to be able to assist and do that in a proper or better or, you know, more productive way that helps the long-term future of the environment really resonates strongly with me. So I'm not sure if that's unpicking it very well for you, because I really feel there's a level of, sort of undescribability, if that's a word, in terms of what it means to me. But and it wasn't like it was from day dot. I grew up in a suburban, area that, I can't say that I had a lot of connection other than a big backyard, because houses in those days did have them.
I remember them.
But I certainly had an affinity with animals from very, very young, and I think their connection to their natural environment enabled me to have a sort of second layer of connection to the environment. And then not long after my husband and I moved around several times, we started to look at rural properties, and we've been here now for over 20 years, and I just am so grateful that I live in this environment, let alone in COVID time, but in terms of just the fact that I get to connect with and see and nurture and conserve and help protect that natural environment that I live with and around.
I can hear, like, the word that's coming up for me when I'm listening to the way that you're expressing it is there's almost a reverence for the land and the way that the indigenous culture has that connection, and that you've learned over the years, and it's come up inside of you as well, this reverence for the land and wanting to contribute. Does that feel like a fair word to use?
I think that's a great word. I mean, I think, respect was probably something I would grab at. And I'm conscious as well, because I really hope this is not being insensitive or naive in terms of what that term means to Indigenous culture, because I'm sure there is a lot more to it. I'm just trying to describe how I have that reverence, and I think that description of how the Indigenous culture looks at it helps provide a bit of a frame of reference.
So it's looking for an entry point, and being culturally sensitive is obviously something that you have a lot of experience in, and by sharing that with someone who's listening, and including myself, who doesn't have that access point, what you're doing is you're actually opening the door a little more for us, which is great, because I think if we can have these conversations that do open those doors, then that provides an opportunity for more people to get curious and to go on this discovery for themselves. So I appreciate you not feeling that you might have the perfect words, but that's okay. We don't need the perfect words. We just need the feeling that's behind them.
Yeah, thanks. And, I think that's where I helped set up the National Museum of Australia and worked there for quite a number of years. And that provided me an amazing experience of insight into, the Indigenous story and, its history and how it looks at culture and kin and family and environment. And there is so much more to the Indigenous culture than we see or portray or, come across in media, etc. And there is a lot in terms of the wholeness of how they view their world that I think we miss a lot in our Western culture. So, yeah, thanks for that sort of summary.
Oh, I love that word, the wholeness of how they see the world. That's just such a delicious word. It's such an inclusive word. Not just little slithers, but the wholeness. I love that. So if we understand that side, and then you were drawn to one of the other concrete ways, tangible ways in which you could contribute to the environment was the care of animals. So in terms of being a wildlife carer, could you talk to us about how that came into your world?
Well, it sort of fell into my world, I have to admit. Again, I don't know about you, but I look back now on sort of life moments and re-experience a slight feeling of deliciousness about how they came about, because at the time, it wasn't like they were planned, or you didn't necessarily get that feeling at the time of, oh my goodness, this is going to be amazing. But, looking back on it, and essentially it was when I moved onto our rural property and driving along rural roads coming home from work, you, of course, unfortunately consistently come across native wildlife that needs assistance or has been injured or hit by cars, etc. And it was a place of trying to work out, well, what can one do? And after a few months of moving out here, the local show was on and I was wandering around there. I distinctly remember it because it was one of those horrible, 40-degree days or something. And came across the stand for our local wildlife group, because the way it works in New South Wales is there's licensed groups that have a license to assist and rehabilitate and care and rescue and release native wildlife. So you actually have to be a licensed individual. And essentially I went up to the stand, so if you can picture what that's like at a show where they've got their wares out and the pamphlets and some amazing volunteers behind the table with the tablecloth, and essentially just started talking to them and, signed up to the orientation course a few weeks later, and then was offered the chance to, you could do different things. You could be a rescuer, you could be a carer if you want to be a carer. There's species that you can do in terms of birds or macropods, which is wallabies and kangaroos, or wombats or possums or reptiles, all sorts of things. And then there are specialist courses. So I ended up all in the space of probably about 3 months doing the orientation course and then the macropod course. And that got me started caring for kangaroos and wallabies. And yeah, I remember the first day that I got the call to say, would you like to go and pick up a joey? It's located here, and driving out in the car with all my pristine new liners, flannelette that are all, clean and perfectly new at that point, and thinking, oh my God, what am I doing? It sort of started from there. And I've been very lucky. I mean, it certainly comes with a fair bit of stress, but I've managed to weave a fairly full-on working life with looking after wildlife. It just means you get super, super organised in terms of what your day is going to be like. And I've had many, many years of not full night's sleep. But, it grew from there, and I've been doing it for 20 years. I do kangaroos and wallabies and wombats, and I used to do possums, but in the interest of time, I haven't done them for a few years. And it's just... it's another sort of description where we were heading with the description of country, connection to country. It's a similar sort of thing in terms of wildlife. I just feel amazingly privileged to be able to assist this wildlife, and saddened sometimes by the circumstances that have meant they've needed to come out of their natural environment. But it's just been an amazing experience. And don't get me wrong, it's not all fluffy, cute moments. There are some fairly torturous and sad and difficult ones, but I find it a real privilege. I find, there's this level of stillness that you have to get into when you're looking after an animal, because it doesn't matter what else you've got on your plate or what's due or what you have to do. This little animal needs its bottle. It needs food. It needs to be able to live. And so you just, in a way, stop what I sometimes describe as the frantic spinning of the human world and get to experience a connection with a little being that eventually will go on to become, released back into its natural environment. And it's been a journey that's been amazing. I've undertaken a whole lot of roles as a result of that connection to wildlife, both in terms of I deliver some training in terms of now how to look after macropods, and I've done that for a number of years, and I sit on a number of boards that are associated with wildlife, and that has provided me a more strategic perspective in terms of what we're doing that we could help a longer term pathway for them, given that our human existence is sometimes encroaching more and more into their natural environments. So, hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel of where it started, and it's continued and it's still continuing.
Oh, I love how you can hear the expansion. I think sometimes we recognize an opportunity. Yes, we don't know what's going to happen, but it just feels right. You described being at that show and seeing, I could see the table, I could see the tablecloth, I could see the people. And it's almost like you recognize somewhere deep inside that this is a thing. Like you were led to it, and then we leap. We have no idea what's on the other side, but the heart's saying, this needs to be looked at. This needs to be explored. That's the perfect example of a next chapter opening up to you. And what I was hearing was this real sense of connection and fulfillment. I mean, on one hand, we've got the desire for contribution, which is just an essential part of who we are as humans, I'd like to think. And then the payoff, and I use that word very carefully. I don't mean that there has to be, but it works most beautifully when there is that sense of fulfillment, and the two of them merge together. Contribution, fulfillment are dancing hand in hand, into the bush in your scenario.
With a joey hopping beside your feet, yes.
Absolutely. So then there's another turn here, which is what the two green threads is really all about. So on one hand, we've got this deep understanding, connection with, commitment to getting out of that frantic spinning of the human world, as you so beautifully described, and taking care and helping these creatures be rehabilitated and then rescued, released back into the environment. But then you started to realize that there is a mental health piece that sits alongside the caring fraternity in terms of how much they're giving. Could you talk to us about how that became a part of your world, the recognition of the role and the stress that happens as a result, and how we need to take care of our carers? There was some personal experiences that really highlighted that for you, if you're happy to share.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, essentially, as I described, there is a sort of one-on-one level of connection and relationship that you have as an individual doing this for wildlife in terms of assisting them and getting them back to their natural environment. And you're doing that often in a group setting. Different states do it in different ways, but certainly I'm part of a local group. And I realised over a number of years, and I guess it sort of mirrors in a way a general path that society was going down, where there wasn't a lot, in fact, there was none, real conversation or focus or space really to talk about the fact that what you were doing might be having an impact. And we described the positive impact just before, but also sometimes there's a negative impact. And it can be, depending on, I guess, individuals and their lives and how they approach this, quite a consuming and intensive experience. And I realised there were a lot of risk factors that, from a psychological, emotional, mental point of view, existed in this sector that meant that we as wildlife volunteers were at higher risk of exposure, I guess, to our mental well-being. And, they consist of exposure to trauma, exposure to grief, pressures in terms of time and finances, and that can sometimes provide strains to relationships. There's a level of distance between a lot of us in terms of across Australia. There's actually 15,000 registered wildlife carers, and we're quite disparate in terms of how we're spread around the country. There's obviously a large proportion of people that may be doing it in regional and remote areas, so there's a sort of level of isolation that it can exist. So when you started to list these against what was a personal experience, which I'll talk about in a sec, I started to realise that there really wasn't a lot of attention and focus on what I would describe the people side of the people looking after the wildlife. And, this is not to be an either or. It's not about, whether you focus on how you, build understanding and knowledge on looking after wildlife, and then separately, do you have time, or is it possible or relevant to also then look at the human side? Because surely we're just doing this for the wildlife. But the reality is the wildlife only get assisted by humans, and humans have to be in the strongest state possible to be able to do that. So, yeah, I essentially started to understand the risk factors, and it took me quite a number of years before I could even get to articulate what I had a sense of. And part of that was brought to bear by a personal experience that I had with my family, with my dad, who was just the most important person in my life. He was very, very fundamental to who I was growing up and what family meant to me. And essentially he went through a period of massive mental instability and to the point of multiple attempted suicides. And I really became confronted with what I call the fragility of the mind and just how strong it can be in terms of how it manifests and takes over what was a life, that he had, like anyone really, before. And so that journey that I went on with him was very confronting. It brought me into the heightened state of mental well-being and psychiatric hospitals and all sorts of things that I started to understand just a little bit more what it would mean if you weren't in a mental and emotional state, and particularly in a state where you couldn't talk about it, or you couldn't connect with, well, is it okay to feel this way? And particularly in an environment, when you look to wildlife, where there's sometimes an overriding rhetoric that says, I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing this for the wildlife, so I don't matter.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation, and perhaps it's inspiring you to start your own next chapter. Don't forget to pop over to my website where you can order a copy of my book, Your Next Chapter, Ditch Your Doubt, Own Your Worth, and Build the Business You Really Want. In it, I'll take you through the next chapter change cycle that will help you develop the clarity and confidence to move into this next stage of your business and life. Just go to angelarasmus.com/Your Next Chapter book. I can feel, or first and foremost, thank you for being so open about the path that's led there. You and I, before we hit record on this conversation, talked about how when it comes to the fragility of our mental health, it is a conversation that more people are having, but that needs to continue. That needs to be expanded. I mean, I've got, how did you describe it? We had a family of great case studies, as opposed to my description of mental health challenges.
A smorgasbord. I described it as.
Smorgasbord. I like
that resulted in the potential best case study that someone could pick up on.
That was it, because I was using it. It's like wildfire, because there's certainly things that have happened in my family, and when you're exposed to these challenges, it can bring about a sensitivity and an awareness of where things, where change is needed, where focus is needed, where expansion is needed. So I really appreciate you being able to share that story with us, and where it led you to. This to me, there's in the next chapter cycle of change that I talk about in the book that this whole series is celebrating. The first step in the cycle is discontent, and that can be discontent within, where it's something that you're doing that just doesn't feel as though you're contributing and feeling fulfilled, and so there is a call to change. But that discontent can also be triggered by what you are witnessing and what you are seeing, and this desire to make a difference, to address what you see as an opportunity or something that's just not going to work long term. And that's what you were seeing. You were seeing that there was this need to put our own oxygen masks on, to use that very simple description, before we put it on the joey. And so it's great that you responded to that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially it was a sort of combined theme of capacity building and the need for sustainability, because at the end of the day, it is likely that there will be a future where increasingly wildlife will need assistance. And frankly, I wanted to be around for long enough to keep doing that. And there are too few volunteers not to have others, along the way with me. So that did lead me to establish, right at the end of 2018, a national registered charity called Two Green Threads, which essentially, as I said, is trying to provide some capacity building for the wildlife volunteer sector. And offer resources and information and a space to acknowledge and enable people to talk about the combined, sort of human and what we bring to that world of assisting our wildlife.
And that sounds wonderful. So if I'm a wildlife carer and I am recognizing that there is, I guess the word that I would use without being within the fraternity is a feeling of burnout, a feel as though I'm disappearing a little bit. What will I experience when I come to Two Green Threads? How are you actually extending that space?
So we've been slowly building some resources which offers information, so podcasts, webinars, PDF downloads, that tries to give people a level of understanding, acknowledgement, and access to ways in which, in the safety of their own home, they can, read and talk with others in their own network about, a language. Essentially, part of what this is about is to try and give the sector the capacity for shared language on this, because it's been silent for so long, and this way that there's a opportunity to sort of respectfully and quite neutrally say, this is having an impact on me and this is what I'm sort of seeing. And like you said, in terms of trying to offer people we're rolling out a whole lot of courses. We just did a webinar last week on I don't care about myself, I'm doing this for the animals, and it was all about self-care and self-sustainability as I reframe it. And this is the start of, you know, a rollout of resources in that way so that people can have the information that helps them understand what they might be going through and put some language and level of awareness around that to enable, you know, seeking professional assistance or having the capacity to talk with one another about, you know, what that means.
I love that idea of providing a shared language. It's that identification as to, oh, this is what's going on for me, and recognizing that other people are also experiencing it. Quite often we need that, the person to step forward first, that then gives us permission to go, oh, I can talk about that. I think it's kept in the shadows so often how we're feeling, and there's a little bit of almost, you know, martyrdom. I've got to keep going regardless. But you're absolutely right. If we don't look at the self-care piece, then, you know, capacity building is not possible. Sustainability is out the freaking window.
Yeah.
that shared language is just vital.
It never ceases to amaze me, the level of comfort. I mean, I should only talk for myself. I shouldn't talk for others. But the level of comfort that is derived from hearing someone else do something and going, oh, it's not just me. You know, it's sometimes so simple. And I think I said to you before I started this podcast, I'm not particularly comfortable talking about myself. And I often start with, why would anyone be interested in hearing about me? And it's a similar sort of thing in terms of when I've had to give speeches or talks. I always start from a place of, why would anyone be interested? But then I remember, I don't sit there listening to other people going, oh, why am I listening to this? I listen with avid interest. So,
yes.
You know, there's this layer of, I think, you know, where I started this thread of conversation, of amazement, of relief, that sometimes when you hear what other people are doing, you go, oh, that's me, or that's why, or that makes sense, or, you know, that sort of trigger of how you process what it is you're hearing and be able to then overlay that back into your own life.
Oh, you've hit the nail on the head, and this is exactly why I'm motivated to do the work in the world that I do. A big piece of which, as I explained to you, was sharing the stories and facilitating the conversations that inspire next chapters. Because I believe that we all have such experience and wisdom and insights inside of us, and if we don't hear other people talking about their small experiences, because we don't have to be Gandhi, we don't have to save the world, we can just be focusing on our wee aspect of the world. But if you can imagine every woman, and I am speaking specifically about women on this podcast, every woman doing their bit, and not doing their bit that's been given to them by someone else, but they have recognized that there is something that's calling them. And I think it's beautiful how universally we're all called to different things. If we were all called to be a dentist, then there'd be nothing else in the world. If we were all called to rescue the Joeys, then we'd starve. You know, it's like we all need to be called in a different direction. And the power of our individual stories is indisputable. So that's why I really appreciate people like yourself who are happy to come on the podcast and share that experience, strength, hope, example that will inspire somebody else to step into their story as well.
Thanks.
You're most welcome. But that feeling of imposter syndrome, you know, why would people listen to me? That is a universal one. I've heard it in so many different shapes and forms. And I loved when I asked you, because you're obviously on the stories section of my website as well, that what was something that you would say to people who are standing on the edge of their own next chapter. And there's a beautiful quote that you used about failing and flying. Do you want to talk about that? Do you want to talk about that one? Why does that one grab you?
I mentioned a quote that I have to say spoke to me quite heavily, because when I started Two Green Threads, I didn't start it with this overwhelming sense of, I have to do this. This is what needs to be done. It was a real constant sort of voice about, should you be doing this? Is this what you're meant to be doing at this point? I was in a pretty deep grief cycle, and I remember hearing a psychologist who I knew, we weren't talking about me specifically, but she made some comment about, you know, people that are in deep grief often grab something else to distract themselves. And I was thinking, oh my God, am I doing this? And so I lived with and still have some element of, is this real? Is this going to make a difference? Should I be doing this? Is this what I'm meant to be contributing to? And I, do a lot of other things as well. And so there was a level of self-doubt, I guess, I was carrying fairly strongly. And I came across this Australian organisation that was making bracelets, and on the bracelets they had different phrases, and I have to admit some of them were rather rude and I was a bit shocked by, but there's this one that I came across that I went, oh, and I think it was obviously meant to be bought and then given to someone else, but I sort of had to buy it for myself in the end just to sort of remind me. And it was essentially, what if I fail, ... but oh, my darling, what if you fly?
Yeah.
And it was a pretty powerful statement to try and constantly bring me back from, but if I just tried, and as long as I did no harm, then it's okay. I can still do a step forward and a step forward. So it's been a sort of in my back of my head anti-self-doubt voice that I've sort of grabbed, and I have to admit that I, wear the bracelet every now and again just to make sure I even read it to myself. So yeah, I found that phrase to be quite helpful for the state that I was in.
I think it's a beautiful phrase, and I love how if we can identify an anchor, something that anchors us, because my experience has been everybody feels doubt. It never goes away. Even those people that you see that are out there doing incredible things in public and seem to be, coiffed and articulate and ticking all the success boxes, they have doubt as well. It's a natural part of the creative process, as one of my other guests has expressed. And I think there is the personification of an inner critic. Like, I like to give that dialogue in my head, the character that's telling me everything that's going to go wrong. I like to give her a name to sort of make it a little bit more concrete and identify that it's her. My critic is horrible Helga in high heels, just for a bit of insight. And her job, like, she is gainfully employed at keeping me safe. That's her job. And so if I'm stepping into the unknown, if I am teetering along a growth edge, she's going to get all uppity. She's going to get all uppity, and she's the one that says to look at your phrase, what if you fail? What if you fail? Where on the other side is a deeper voice that's inside, a little quieter, is your inner sage. And she's the one that's saying, but my darling, what if you fly? So I love how you found that anchor piece that keeps bringing you back to the, no one gets things perfect. And what is failure anyhow? It's just something that didn't work out, and it's information for us to do something differently next time. And, the progression of Two Green Threads certainly tells us you're not failing, my darling.
Yeah, and I think it helped me, and I came to this, pretty much at the beginning as well, a frame, what would success look like? And, thankfully I wasn't aiming for, I have to reach X thousands of people, or, provide life-saving, resources to so many people. To me, if, a few people got to have a sense of relief and gained some access to information that made their journey easier or better or more satisfying or more comforting, and that enabled them to continue to keep looking after wildlife, then that was success. So,
yeah.
And, I think that's where, part of the space that you're dealing with is individuals who are often starting, up something where they're investing not only themselves but potentially their own money, or trying to find, funding sources that enables them to lift off. And I started this funding it myself, and I continue to fund it. One of my paid, I'm essentially a non-executive director, and I sit on a number of boards. That's my career now. And the payments that I receive from any of those goes into supporting Two Green Threads, so that, there's a sort of sustainable financial overarching business feel to it, rather than just, also having to contend with, well, how will I fund anything? So, and I've, a part of along the way found some great supporters to be able to continue that journey. Other charities, the International Fund for Animal Welfare or the Foundation for National Parks and Wildlife. And it's just been one of those experiences where I think equally the self-doubt voice also has to be contended with that what is success picture.
Yes.
Because if that's not expressed, then it drives a level of expectation that, may or may not be realistic or possible or achievable. And your self-doubt and your self-critic voice just gets, a grand field to play on, if that's the case.
That's such an important point, and it's funny. It's one of the things that I talk about a fair bit in the Your Next Chapter book, which is the danger of expectations, that they're actually premeditated resentments if you're not careful. And yes, to give fodder to your inner critic to have a field day as well. So I love how you've got very clear on what your definition of success is in this respect. And that's incredibly important, that whatever endeavor we're on, what does it look like for us? And it's getting that clarity, and that helps you make decisions as you move forward, because you're much clearer on where it is that you're going. And I think we also, part of our discussion here is that we don't always know what that future is going to look like. I mean, our businesses, our charities, our projects, our endeavors, they evolve. They're like a living, breathing creature that is evolving and changing and moving as we move forward. And who knows what Two Green Threads might look like in a couple of years, in 5 years, in 10 years.
Yeah, and I think something that I did hear someone say to me early on in the start of setting up Two Green Threads and what it would be and what it could offer, and I can't remember how they phrased it, but essentially what I heard was, you have to remember that what you're establishing is not you in its entirety. You still exist outside of what it is you're establishing. So there needs to be an understanding that although you are nurturing and giving birth to this baby, you can't wrap yourself so much into it that you're lost as a result of wherever it goes or whatever it does. And, I think that was sort of an important little marker early in the journey, that despite how strongly I was feeling about it, particularly as a result of the personal circumstances I went through, that I tried to maintain an understanding that Two Green Threads was an entity. It was setting up to offer services. And I think it was partly helped by, I don't pay myself. I do this role pro bono. And, that sort of took out a whole layer of what might otherwise be, a sort of driver and complication. Mm. And, again, I got a sort of another little marker in a few months ago, where I sort of realised that, picking up on what you said, Angela, about where it would go in the future and what it would be, I may or may not be part of Two Green Threads in some future, so that's sort of the ultimate recognition and understanding that what I'm setting up is, really important to me, and I really would love it to make a difference. And obviously I have a drive for, excellence and professionalism and, the best opportunity that's around. But at the end of the day, I will do my best to shepherd it where it needs to go. And at some stage in the future, if it's able to fly, picking up on what we talked before, without me, and if that was the right thing at the time, that would be okay.
That would be okay. That's a beautiful, drawing to a close of this conversation between us, that understanding that you are not the business. It is not, the business sits, or the charity in this case, sits alongside you. And I think that's incredibly important for us to understand. A lot of women that I support are personal brands. They are the business, and their sense of their own worth can get so enmeshed in the success or failure or, different degrees of the business itself. And we really do need to have that separation between us and it. So that's a beautiful way that you've described it. We're shepherding it into the world so it can make the contribution that it's here for, and we can look upon it with pride, but know that there may be a time when we let it fly on its own wings.
Yeah, yeah.
That's wonderful. Yep. Suzy, thank you so much for having such a beautifully open and wholehearted conversation with me today. I've really enjoyed it. And for anyone that's listening, where can they go and find out more about the work that you're doing in the world?
So the website is twogreenthreads.org, and the two is expressed in spelling, TWO. So it was twogreenthreads.org, and the website has, information on there. And my email address is Suzy, SUZY, at twogreenthreads.org. And so if people wanted to email me, and hopefully, whether it's general public looking to support the people that are doing this vital community service, looking after wildlife, or individuals within the sector. I'm hoping that, if they come across this, they might, have access to information they didn't realise was there.
That's brilliant. I'll make sure that those links are on the podcast page as well so that people can track you down. And thank you again. I've really loved the conversation.
Thanks so much, Angela, for being a beautiful natural self to draw out the threads.
Thank you. And to you, my lovely listener, I hope, as always, that this particular conversation that you've had the opportunity to listen in on has provided you with that spark of inspiration. There's been so much goodness shared here in terms of understanding that the thing that you're here to contribute, sometimes it just hits you in an unexpected way. And sometimes you might resist it a little bit. You might doubt the validity on it. You might wonder, where is this going to take me? All of those questions are normal. All of that doubt, the feeling of imposter syndrome, all the things. Yes, you might fail, but what, my darling, if you did fly? Keep that concept at your heart, at the heart level, as you are expanding into this next chapter, because you just never know where it may lead. So thank you for spending your time here with me today. And until I release the next episode, take very good care. Thanks so much for listening to the Your Next Chapter podcast. I really do appreciate your time. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on Facebook or LinkedIn. And of course, my website, angelarasmus.com. If you enjoy the show, I'd love you to share it with another woman who's in the midst of business and life beyond 40. And if you love it, a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen in on would be fabulous. Reviews somehow impact that deeply mysterious algorithm and make it easier for the show to be found, which is always a good thing. So thanks again, and until next time, take care.